went forth, and all his household after him, and the king left 10 women, which were concubines, to keep the house. And the king went forth, and all the people after him, and tarried in a place that was far off. And all his servants passed on beside him, and all the Cherethites, and all the Pelethites, and all the Gittites, 600 men which came after him from Gath, passed on before the king. Then said the king to Ittai the Gittite, Wherefore goest thou also with us? Return to thy place, and abide with the king, for thou art a stranger, and also an exile. Whereas thou camest but yesterday, should I this day make thee go up and down with us? Seeing I go whither I may, return thou, and take back thy brethren. Mercy and truth be with thee. And Ittai answered the king, and said, As the Lord liveth, and as my lord the king liveth, surely in what place my lord the king shall be, whether in death or life, even there also will thy servant be. And David said to Ittai, Go and pass over. And Ittai the Gittite passed over, and all his men, and all the little ones that were with him. And all the country wept with a loud voice, and all the people passed over. The king also himself passed over the brook Kidron, and all the people passed over toward the way of the wilderness. And lo, Zadok also, and all the Levites were with him, bearing the ark of the covenant of God. And they set down the ark of God, and Abiathar went up, until all the people had done passing out of the city. And the king said unto Zadok, Carry back the ark of God into the city. If I shall find favor in the eyes of the Lord, he will bring me again, and shew me both it and his habitation. But if he thus say, I have no delight in thee, behold, here am I. Let him do to me as seemeth good unto him.
Many of the fondest memories from my childhood came from my many years of playing Little League football. I started playing football all the way back in the 2nd grade, and I still remember it like it was yesterday. I can still remember the excitement that I'd feel every August when I went to register and pick up my pads. Remember the butterflies that would form in the pit of my stomach as I would do lunges and high knees during the pregame warm-ups. I remember the rush that would run through my body whenever I would make a big hit and hear the parents erupt in the stands. It was unforgettable. And with each passing year, I learned more about the X's and O's. My love for the game would grow deeper, and I'd continue to get better on the field. And by 5th grade, I had my heart set on being a part of my first championship winning team. I was playing better than ever before. I had my best group of teammates yet, and I even had a space cleared on the shelf in my room for the championship trophy. For the longest, things were going according to plan. We had finished the regular season in first place. We even got a first-round bye in the playoffs, and all we had to do was win 2 more games to become champs. I still remember that first playoff game. Early on, I missed a tackle and the other team scored right out the gate. But it was cool because my team scored right back. And then we scored again. And then we scored again. We had a comfortable lead going into halftime. I felt good. I was just 2 quarters away from the championship game. But our opponents just wouldn't go away. They fought back, tied the game, and after 4 quarters of grueling action, we were headed into overtime. I can still recall the chills that ran down my spine as I tensely awaited the overtime period, desperately hoping that my team would be able to pull out an exciting win like the ones that I'd see in the games on TV or in the sports movies. But despite my team's efforts and the great season that we had up to that point, we were all left heartbroken as the opposing team's running back sprinted into the end zone for the game-winning touchdown. And I walked off the field that night, tears rolling down my cheeks, drowning in the devastation of the moment, crushed by the fact that 2 other teams would be playing for the championship that I wanted so badly. Knowing that the shelf in my room would remain empty. And I was hit with the dejecting reality that when it came to my goal of winning that championship, it was game over. In that moment, as I sat in the passenger seat of my father's car, head pressed against the window as my mind replayed the disheartening loss that I had just experienced, I felt, for the first time as a 10-year-old boy, the pain and distress that comes with having a goal, dream, or vision that is cherished, pursued, and thought about, only to helplessly watch it slip away. A feeling that some listening today have, are, or will go through during this ongoing game that we call life. And if that's your story today, then you are someone that David could relate to in today's passage. And for those who know about David, it may be surprising to hear him associated with the game over moment. Because for so much of his journey, things just always kind of worked out for him. David's story begins when God, after becoming fed up with King Saul's nonsense, sends Samuel to go anoint a new king. Samuel then strolls into Bethlehem, and after passing over all of David's older brothers, Samuel tells David that God has chosen him as the next king of Israel. Things get even better for David when he, as a teenager, kills Goliath after nobody thought that he could, and puts himself on the map. And after this, David is the man in Israel, which upsets King Saul so much that he makes it his mission to have David killed. For years, King Saul's on the hunt, looking to track David down and take his life. But he's never able to, and David avoids King Saul's vengeance until King Saul eventually dies in battle. And then David, after all of this, becomes king. And David reigns over Israel for over 20 years. Things had fallen into place for David. He was winning. Everything was playing out how he wanted it to. But all of that would soon begin to change. Things all took a turn for David when one day he sends his men off to battle, but for whatever reason, he doesn't go himself. And while David is at the crib alone one night, he sees Bathsheba, the wife of one of his troops. And David, upon seeing her, makes a bad decision. And then he makes another bad decision to cover up for the first one. And David's actions would end up impacting his life in ways that he could have never imagined. Because later, David is confronted about his sin by a man named Nathan the prophet, who tells David a parable, a made-up story, in order to help him realize what he's done wrong. David then confesses his fault, and Nathan tells him that while he won't be killed for what he's done, that the sword will never depart from his house. And over the course of the next several years, a series of tragic and chaotic occurrences would take place within David's family. And by the time that all of this had run its course, David's oldest living son, Absalom, had developed an intense bitterness and disdain for his father. And these feelings of resentment were so strong that it leads Absalom to devise a plan to overthrow David and take the throne for himself. Absalom begins this plan by sitting outside the gate every day. And whenever anybody would be coming to see David for judgment or to make a request or to get assistance about an issue they were having, Absalom would pull them to the side and ask them what their concern was. And after they shared, he'd tell them about how right they were, how they deserved whatever they were looking to get from King David. And Absalom, I'm sure, would then mention how if he were ever the king, he'd make sure that they were taken care of. And Absalom for years stood outside the gate, shaking hands, kissing babies, and gaining support. And then he executed the next phase of his plan. Absalom goes to David and says, "Hey, Dad, I need to go make a vow in Hebron." And David responds in the last words he'd ever say to his son, with no clue that any scheme is taking place, tells Absalom, "Go in peace." And Absalom then goes to Hebron, gathers up a group of spies who have gotten behind him and his movement, and Absalom has them run throughout all the tribes of Israel crying, "Absalom reigns in Hebron." And then Absalom pulls up to Jerusalem with 200 men that he got to accompany him, to give the impression that these declarations were true, that there was a changing of the guard happening, that he was becoming king. And what's important to remember is that there were no cell phones back then. There was no 6 o'clock news. There was no social media. So people didn't have much to go off of besides what they saw and heard. People who heard this news and saw Absalom coming with so many people headed into town might have thought that Absalom was being made king because David died, or that David may have willingly handed the kingdom over to Absalom in his old age. Nobody had any details, including David's messenger, who goes to him and tells him that the hearts of the people are with Absalom. And as David hears this heartbreaking news, he tells his men that they have to leave, that they have to get out as soon as they can. Because David now knew that Absalom was in rebellion, that he was doing whatever he could to take power, and that the only way to avoid a huge battle breaking out was for them to leave. So David gathers up all of his men, the men that he met the last time he was in this position and had to flee because someone that he loved turned against him. And David is left having to abandon a nation that he waited years to rule over and that he expected to reign over until he died. David had to swallow the fact that after all the trouble that he went through to become the king and as the king, after all the battles he fought, all the good he tried to do, this was how his story was going to end. And David faced the game over moment that some of us are all too familiar with. The moment when we realize that the plan isn't going to work out. That the happily ever after isn't coming at the end of this movie. That the moment when we realize that the Red Sea isn't going to part. That this prodigal son or daughter isn't coming home. That this crucifixion won't be followed by a resurrection. And we're devastated because we were sure that this game would end in our favor. Because we worked so hard for so long, yet still fell short. And because deep down within us, there's a restless feeling that we have because we just know that it shouldn't have ended this way. And as David leaves Jerusalem with his men for what in his mind could be the very last time, he notices a man named Ittai the Gittite leaving with them. Now, to share a little bit of info about Ittai the Gittite, besides the fact that he has an awesome name, Ittai had just started working for David the day before all this happens. And when David sees that this guy is joining he and his men during this chaotic, miserable, and uncertain time, he tells him to go back to Jerusalem and to work for Absalom. Because, after all, he has just gotten there the day prior. He just filled out his W-2 form. Surely, Ittai can't have any real loyalty to David anyways. So David does what he thinks is best and he wishes him well and sends him off. But just as David is about to turn and continue his departure, Ittai the Gittite says, "As the Lord liveth, and as the Lord my king liveth, surely in what place my Lord the king shall be, whether in death or life, even there also will thy servant be." Ittai expresses that he has David's back, that he wants to be there for him, that he will go wherever he goes and wherever he faces, and that he'll stick with David. The text shows us that when we are in a dark phase of life, when we are going through devastating letdowns in the most pivotal aspects of life, when we experience setbacks that have us feeling afraid of what tomorrow will look like, when our world seems to be crashing down around us, God has a way of providing us with the right people who can give us the love, support, and encouragement that we need right when we need it. God will send the right people at the right time. People who will stand in our corner without hesitation. People who will extend themselves to us with pure intentions. People who will be there for us when we feel down and out. God can use the moments of brokenness to develop or reestablish bonds with people who will help provide the hope we need when life gives us outcomes that are hard to accept. After Ittai's exchange with David, the scripture then further paints the picture of what this trip out of Jerusalem was like for David and his men. How large masses of people are taking this unsettling journey with David. How the whole nation is weeping uncontrollably. And how this dark path takes them into the wilderness. However, as I read the spine-chilling description of David's departure, one thing really confused me. I noticed how the verse referred to David as the king. And this didn't make any sense because the entire story is detailing how David seemingly had his throne taken from him by his very own son. How he was losing what he worked decades to attain and to build. And how now his life was being thrown into disarray because of all that's happened. So what's the text talking about? However, I found clarity when remembering how David's journey to becoming king began in the first place. I had to remember that it wasn't because David filled out an application that he became king. It wasn't because of a campaign or election that he became king. It wasn't because of any of his qualifications that he became king. But it was because God proclaimed him to be king. And no matter how big the failure, how frequent the setbacks, or how undesirable an outcome, we have to know that God's proclamations always outweigh our predicaments. And even though our struggles can create and deepen insecurities within us and make us question who we really are in the grand scheme of things, we have to know that our identity isn't predicated on the outcomes. We are not defined by who and what is gone. We are not defined by the rejections and failures that we've experienced. We are not defined by what we don't have or what we haven't accomplished. We are not defined by the areas of life that don't look the way we want them to or the way that they used to. What we have to understand in our game over moments is that the truth of who we are, the legitimacy, the value, the purpose that exists in our lives, all stems from what God has proclaimed us to be, and not from the undesirable positions that we may find ourselves in. We have to find a way, when things are at their worst and insecurities are at their highest, to see ourselves how God sees us. We have to know that in spite of it all, we are still loved, still seen, still worthy, still valuable, still chosen, still usable, still unique, still anointed. And we have to know that we are greater than where we may be in this season of life. Amongst David and the large group traveling with him into the wilderness was a man named Zadok, who was the high priest. And Zadok's presence in the passage is very interesting because of what he brings with him. Because the text doesn't mention Zadok bringing necessities or belongings like you might expect, but instead Zadok has brought on this journey the Ark of the Covenant from the temple. And the Ark of the Covenant wasn't just a decoration, but it was one of the most definitive symbols of faith in God's presence that existed at the time. It was a reminder that God would protect and deliver his people. And Zadok bringing the Ark in this moment from the temple was a way of trying to ensure that God would be on the side of David in this moment. It was a way of trying to indicate that God would put David back on the throne. And the intent behind this is one that many of us can relate to because of the desire that we as human beings have to take matters into our own hands when things aren't going the way that we'd like or the way that we think that they should. The tendency to fixate on how we can influence the outcome of things in life that are important to us and trying to control that which we don't really have power over in order to cope with the stress and pain that these moments bring. Even when we know that it's not the right way to deal. However, David responds by telling Zadok to take the ark back to the city. Because David only wanted to regain the kingdom if it was what God wanted for him. He decides that he's not going to try to force God's will. David makes a choice that we have to bring ourselves to make when life brings us face to face with game over moments. The decision to release the urge to seek assurance through trying to manipulate our situations, and the choice to embrace God's will, even if it means not ending up with what we want or what we think we deserve. David realizes that attempting to take control of the situation might feel good in the moment, but it will end in disaster. And like David, we have to learn to find fulfillment, not in getting the results we want, not in having the plan come together, not in ending up where we want, but in pursuing and embracing God's will. When it looks like the game over moments for whatever we've been trying to pursue or whatever we've held dear, we've got to find a way. Despite the anxiety, despite the pain, despite the uncertainty about where things go from here, to embrace what God wants for us. And this isn't done through trying to convince ourselves or others that we don't care about what's at stake. It's not done through giving up hope that things will get better. But embracing God's will is about silencing the voice in our heads that tell us to do whatever we can to end up with the result we want. It's about opening our hearts and our minds to what God truly wants for us. It requires us to accept the reality of what God has given us for this season, even if it wasn't what we worked for. And it takes us trusting that after all is said and done, the result that we end up with, the direction that we end up going, the position that we find ourselves in, is the one that God will use to carry out his will, whatever that may be. We have to learn to get out of God's way, knowing that whatever he does or whatever he sees to fit to happen will all work for our good. We have to know that even when our game is over, God's purpose for our life isn't.